I think I will get started and then I'll pass it to Natasha momentarily. I don't know if the students are able to unmute themselves, but anyhow, we would ask that students to please. We acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We encourage everyone to reflect on the lands where you are located and the indigenous people for whom these lands are traditional territory. And we also acknowledge the labor theft extracted from people of African descent and used to build European wealth and economies globally and in the Canadian nation state, including Newfoundland Labrador's shipbuilding and cod fishery industries, through the violence of transatlantic enslavement. And before we begin, if you were present here, as Natasha explained, there will be Q&A session, and right now, if you have a question, we would appreciate that you put it on there. Natasha also posted it, the polling that is for Q&A. So please do not post anything on the chat because the questions will be monitored through the Slido. And thank you, Natasha. Yeah. So this is our team, and myself, Natasha and Arif, we are international student immigration advisors. Arif is not with us today. I'm going to introduce myself first and I'll pass it to Natasha. So my name is Panis and I'm a regulated international student immigration advisor here at Memorial University. So that means I am licensed and legally able to provide advice to international students around their temporary status in Canada, which is international student status. And so the license I have doesn't cover any other status, meaning that I'm not able to advise on, work permits or permanent residency. So anything that is not related to international student status. Later on, you will learn how to connect with us. But without further ado, I'm just going to pass it to my colleague Natasha, and it will continue.
Great. Thank you so much, Patricia. So by way of introductions, my name is Natasha Clark. My pronouns are she and her, and I'd like to recognize that I'm an uninvited settler here in the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq. It's important, I think, for us to recognize our place within Canada, and Canada has a very dark history in terms of colonization and its treatment of Indigenous peoples, as well as you saw from our labor acknowledgement too, a lot of dark history in terms of immigration and bringing folks over through the slave trade, as well as the head tax on the Chinese and a lot of various parts of Canadian history. And I think it's important in our positions to be able to recognize that as we hope to work towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and to acknowledge really that racism does still exist here in Canada. And we're so happy to welcome you as international students to Canada. But we understand that, not everything is going to be great and perfect. And so we're here for those difficult times as well. So if you do encounter those challenges, please kind of connect with us. All of us have been working in the field of international education for many years, decades, and we particularly are devoted to this aspect of international education, which is your status immigration, right? So it is part of your journey as an international student here to Canada. It's a big part. It's perhaps your first part after getting your admission letter, kind of gaining that study permit, but it doesn't end there. And so that's really what the focus of this session is on. So I'll continue from there. And I'm sure if Arif was here, he'd love to provide his introductions as well. And I will say, you know, we're a team of 3 and we're located in the St. John's campus. And our role is to advise students in the St. John's and the Marine Institute campuses. If we have anybody who happens to be joining us who's a student at our Grenfell campus in Corner Brook, then you also will get to know our lovely colleague, Angela Gomez, who is a regulated immigration advisor for the Grenfell campus as well. So really, this session is meant to provide you all kinds of information that you will need as part of your immigration journey here as an international student. And so our role, as Panisse has mentioned, is to help you with your international student status. So we're going to advise you on your study permits, your visas for entry travel, if you have family members who want to come to visit you, if when you finish your studies you want to apply for a postgrad work permit. That's our scope of service, right? There are so many immigration programs and pathways in Canada, but that's really outside of our scope, right? We do have resources and things we can get you connected with. But the focus of this session is really to give you some of that basic and important information you need to know as an international student coming on a study permit to make sure that you comply with the laws and the conditions, right? And that's our role, really, is to answer those questions, guide you, and advise you on those things. So in today's session, here's what we're going to focus on. We're going to talk about the difference between a visa, or called a TRV, and an ETA, and a study permit. And we're going to discuss the importance of your passport. So we're going to focus on those documents. We're going to talk about how your status as a student, so your enrollment status, if you're registered, if you have to take a leave, how that's going to impact your eligibility to study and to work. And we're going to talk about some of those key terms that you're going to hear and how they impact your immigration. So academic suspension and that sort of thing. If you are in a program that has a work integrated component, we're going to talk about what other permits you might need, like a co-op work permit. And even though you're just starting your journey here, you're not finished, you know, we are going to talk a bit about the postgrad work permit, which may be something you may avail of upon the end of your studies. We also want to discuss, how do you get good, reliable immigration information? We've kind of told you we have these credentials, and that basically allows us to give immigration advice, and not everybody can do that, right? So you have to be careful where you're getting that information. And we want to make sure that you know how you can connect with us, not just now, but also throughout your journey. And so we'll discuss those things. And hopefully we'll have a little bit of fun along the way. And we're going to be quizzing you a bit as we go. Okay. So, you know, please engage with us. We really appreciate that, because it's a lot of information. So we want to take those breaks, and we'll take all your questions at the end. All right, so the first important document that you have in terms of your immigration journey here to Canada is your passport. And that's not a Canadian document at all, right? So as an international student, you have your passport from your home country's government, and that was needed for you to apply for your study permit. It is going to be needed for you to travel to Canada and to present, you know, at the port of entry. It also is important that while you're here as a student, you maintain that valid passport, because every Canadian immigration document you have is not going to go past the validity of your passport. So it's all going to depend on that, right? So generally speaking, when one applies for their study permit from outside of Canada, if it's approved, it's generally approved based on the estimated length of your program. But if your passport happens to expire before you finish your program, you won't get that full duration, right, of your study permit. So you may have to, while you're in Canada, apply and get a new passport so that you can then extend your stay in Canada and extend your study permit. If that is your situation, then that's not anything we can give direct assistance with. You want to connect with your home country's government or your home country's representative in Canada. So many countries will have representatives in Canada through a high commission, through a consulate, through an embassy. Most likely, none of them are going to be located in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. And the part of the province that we are in is an island. So often if you have to connect with those places, there may be travel to other parts of Canada, but not necessarily. Not everybody who needs to extend their passport and work with their home country's representative is going to have to travel, right? You can mail documents back and forth. And every country is going to be different in terms of what is the process for their citizens to extend their passport, how they go about doing that, and how early that they can do that. Okay. So really the main point here with regards to your passport is to know its expiry date, to know that your other Canadian documents are going to depend on that expiry date. So as soon as you can, if you need to, you want to apply, right, to get that new passport. And it's your home country's government who will provide that assistance. All right. The next document we're going to talk about is what we refer to as a visa, entry visa, re-entry visa. Its proper term is a temporary resident visa or a TRV. And this is what it looks like. And a visa, if you have one, is affixed in your passport. So it's a counterfoil. It's essentially a sticker that forms a page of your passport. Now, not everybody who comes to Canada to study will get or will need a visa. A visa is needed if you are from a visa requiring country. So you can find that out through the Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada IRCC website. And if you've applied and been approved for your study permit, you might already have, right, this document. So if you're from a visa requiring country, as part of your study permit application, if your study permit application is going to be approved, you are going to get a request to submit your passport, which you'll do through a visa application center, and then your passport will come back with this visa affixed in it. So it's not a separate application you have to make. If you apply for your study permit and you're from a visa requiring country, you will get this visa automatically. If you are not from a visa requiring country, but you apply for a study permit, then what you will get automatically is something we cannot see or show you a picture of because it is called an electronic travel authorization or an ETA, and it's electronically linked to your passport, right? But that is needed if you're from a non-visa requiring country to enter Canada, just like this visa, if you are from a visa requiring country, is needed to enter Canada. And you can check, if you have a valid ETA through a tool through the IRCC website as well. Now, there's one exception. Like I said, you're either from a visa requiring country and get the TRV, or you're from a non-visa requiring country and you get the ETA. The exception would be for our American students who are American citizens. They do not require either to seek entry to Canada. Their US passport is sufficient for that. Okay. So the purpose of this TRV or for the ETA is to allow you to seek entry to Canada. This is not your actual study permit. This is not what authorizes you to study. This essentially allows you to seek entry to Canada. So you'll see on the visas that there's an issue date, there's an expiry date, and most of them are multiple entry. So it means essentially that you can leave Canada and seek to return multiple times during its validity period. Generally, one's visa would be valid for the length of their studies, and generally one's ETA is typically valid to the length of their passport. But if you're in Canada and you are not finished your studies by this time, of course, you would need to extend your study permit if that's also expiring. You don't necessarily need a valid visa if you're in Canada because a visa is only needed to enter Canada. But if while you're here in Canada, your visa has expired and you think, oh, I'm going to go home, in a couple of months during the break. Well, you would need, in addition to your study permit, a valid visa to come back to Canada. So there is a process that while you're in Canada, if your visa is expiring, for you to apply for another visa if you need to leave and re-enter. Okay. Now, I said that a visa's job and an ETA's job is to allow you to seek entry into Canada. It does not authorize you to study, right? Now, there's kind of one exception to that rule. Generally, to authorize you to study, you need a study permit, but an exception is if you are coming to Canada to do a program of study that is less than 6 months, right, and can be completed in the time you have authorized to enter Canada. So some of our students who are perhaps coming as an exchange student for 1 semester, or might be coming to do our intensive English program at our Grenfell campus for 1 semester, while you could apply for a study permit, you don't necessarily need one, because that exchange semester is less than 6 months, and that semester of your intensive English program is less than 6 months. So for that, you might only have the visa, right, or the ETA, and that would authorize you to be in Canada for up to 6 months, and you could complete that 1 semester. But if you wanted to go beyond that, then you'd need a study permit. Okay, and there's those things. So far we have talked about your passport, obviously is an important document, your visa or your ETA or your US passport for seeking entry into Canada. Okay, so before we go on and talk about our third document, which is the study permit, we just want to check in with folks, and we want you to really engage with us. So we're going to use the chat for this. So you're just going to type in after I read the question really fast if you think this statement is true or false. Okay, and we'll see the responses we get. So number 1, the visa is an official counterfoil document issued by a visa officer abroad that is placed in a person's passport to show that he or she has met the requirements for admission to Canada as a temporary resident. Is this true or false? Perfect. We have a bunch of trues. Excellent. That is absolutely correct. Thank you. All right, we'll move on to number 2. So I want just as many or more responses. Number 2, you can enter Canada with an expired TRV or visa. Yeah, I see mostly false. I see a couple of trues, and it is mostly false. And here's one thing I didn't tell you, but here's one exception. So if after you've come to Canada, you're here in Canada, you have a valid study permit, if you decide and you have the authorization to enter the US, so if you're in Canada and you have authorization to enter the US and you go from Canada to the US and directly back to Canada, to re-enter Canada in that scenario, you actually don't need a valid visa. But any other travel, like even if you were going via the US but to a third country, you would need a valid visa. So there is, an exception in terms of being able to enter Canada on an expired visa but a valid study permit, and that's when you go from Canada to the US and back, or if you go from Canada to St. Pierre and Miquelon. So there are some French islands off the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador, which are our French territories from France. So you can actually go from Newfoundland and go to the French islands and then back and actually not need a valid visa. Yeah. So anyway, there's a lot, and I'm glad, Eloise, thank you, that you might not realize that, because there's a ton of these. Okay, here's an exception to this immigration regulation, right? So if you ever doubt anything or want to check, before you travel, we always encourage you to connect with us, and that's what we're here to be able to answer those questions. All right, so thank you all so much for your engagement on number 2. Let's move on to number 3. A visa authorizes international students to work on or off campus. Is this true or false? Excellent. Yeah, mostly false. I see a couple truths. So it is false. This is really important. Your visa, right, the TRV, is not a status document. It authorizes you to seek entry, right? That is its purpose. In order to work, you have to have a status document and work authorization. We'll talk about that coming up. All right, number 4, a visa can be renewed from within Canada. Is that true or false? Yep. So this is true. And I did mention that briefly when I spoke. So typically the visa you have before coming should generally be valid for the length of your program. Again, it depends on your passport expiry. It depends if you end up taking a bit longer than normal to do your program. But if you need a new visa while you're in Canada, because you have a valid study permit, you can apply for that. Okay. So thanks everyone so much. We'll get into some other quizzes as we go along, but now we're going to discuss the study permit. All right, so this right here is a photo of a study permit. And so as I mentioned, most international students are going to need a study permit to study in Canada. The exception is if you're coming for a program of study that's less than 6 months, it can be completed in that time, your authorized entry to Canada. Okay, so if not, any degree seeking program, any exchange longer than a semester, even if it's 1 semester, sometimes you can still apply for a study permit. You will get the study permit. Now, the study permit is generally applied for when you're outside of Canada, but it's not issued until you enter Canada, but you get the approval, right? So before you travel or make your plans to come here, you really need to wait for that study permit application to be approved. So if the study permit application is going to be approved, like I said, you'll have that request to submit your passport, and you'll get the visa or the ETA depending on your nationality. And then shortly after, you should get what's called a study permit approval letter. The proper term is a letter of introduction or an LOI. And it is a letter that basically says that your application for a study permit has been, approved. Please present this letter at the port of entry. And the LOI will have an expiry date on it. And it also will mention if you had to do a medical exam as part of your entry to Canada, that expiry date. So you can use that approval letter or that LOI to enter Canada at any point during its validity. But you also, when you're seeking entry, have to be sure that your medical exam, if you need one, is still valid. Okay, because not everybody does a medical exam as part of their study permit. So when you then come through your first Canadian port of entry, so it won't necessarily be St. John's, but it'll be the first airport that you land in if you're traveling by air. And so you'll go through the Border Services agents, the Customs and Borders line, and you'll have to, explain you're here to study. You're going to present your LOI, your passport with your visa. They might ask you other questions, so you should be prepared with other documents like your admission letter, proof of your funds, and that sort of thing. Because it's the border officer who's going to kind of have that final say in terms of saying, yes, you can be admitted to Canada, right? You have what you need to request entry, but they're going to be the ones to grant or deny entry. And they will then be the ones to print your study permit, right? So as part of that final approval for entry, if you've been approved for a study permit, they're going to print the document. And this is essentially what you will get that's printed. So before you leave that border services area, it's really important and recommended that you review the information. Look at your name, look at your date of birth, everything spelled correctly, right? Check out the expiry date, right? Look at the conditions that are placed. Look at the institution that's named. So from now on, you should see study permits that look a bit different than this one. This one just says like other University Ontario, but you should actually see Memorial University of Newfoundland listed on your study permit. So make sure you check for that. And under conditions, there'll likely be various sentences that are here. The one that should hopefully be here would be about accepting employment. And so we'll talk about that a bit more. But if you think there's anything off, you can raise that with the border officer, if there may be a mistake. So do check it kind of before you leave that area. All study permits will have this comment at the bottom, which says this does not authorize reentry, right? And so that's the distinction as we talked about. Your study permit is your status document. It's what allows you to stay and be in Canada. Your visa is just allowed to seek entry into Canada. Okay. I see somebody has their hand raised. We're taking questions in the Slido Q&A, and we're going to take them at the end. So please jot down your question or type it in there before you forget. All right, so we're going to continue to talk more about study permits, but based on what we've said so far, let's go back to a quiz. So we're going to use the chat. So once I read the statement, type in as many people as we can get responding if you think this is true or false. So a study permit allows you to enter Canada. Is that true or false? Right. We see that it has that comment on it that this does not authorize entry. That's why you need the valid visa, or you need the valid ETA, or you need to meet one of those exceptions where you don't need a valid visa, like Canada, US and back, or Canada to St. Pierre Miquelon. Also Canada to Greenland, I think, as well, and back. Yeah. Number 2, study permit authorizes you to work if you meet the conditions. Is this true or false? Yeah, perfect. So this is true, and we're going to talk about that in a lot more detail because we understand students often have lots of questions about that. But as I already alluded to, you want to see that condition printed on your study permit that indicates you can work if you're eligible. And number 3, it's not anything we said, but let's see how we get with this question. A study permit cannot be renewed from within Canada. Is this true or false? Yep, perfect. So many correct answers. It is false. Thank you so much, everybody, for engaging. So hopefully your study permit is granted, again, for the time you need to do your program. Generally, they will do it based on the length of your program, but they won't go past your passport. So if you're in that situation, or if you need a bit more time to continue in your studies, then they are going to, you may have to extend your study permit from inside of Canada. And that's certainly something you can do and something we can help you with. Okay. So to be able to understand, I think, more about your study permit, about your work authorization, about your conditions that are placed on you as a student to maintain compliance, I think it's important to have an understanding of some of these key terms, right? Because you're here as a student, you know, your immigration status is entirely dependent on your pursuit of your studies, right? And your status at the institution. So any kind of change in your status as a student is going to have some kind of impact on your immigration status on your study permit. Okay, so the first one here that I'm going to discuss is academic year. So an academic year follows our academic calendar, and that goes from September until August. So we are starting in September to enter our academic year of 2025 to 2026, right? Currently in August of 2025, we're still in our 2024 to 2025 academic year. So students are just finishing the last semester in that academic year. So it's different from a calendar year, and it starts in September. It starts with our fall semester, which runs from September to December, then our winter semester, which runs from January until April, and we have a spring semester, which is May to August, and depending on your program, the spring could be a scheduled break or optional semester, okay? Number 2 term here is full-time status. So we mean full-time student status, right? So you have applied for a study permit most likely based on pursuing a full-time program. So it's important that you maintain your full-time status. So what does Memorial mean by what makes you a full-time student? And what that means is different if you're an undergraduate student and if you're a graduate student. So if you're an undergraduate student, full-time status is determined by the number of credit hours you are registered for in any given semester. So as an undergraduate student, you have to be registered in a minimum of 9 credit hours in a regular academic semester to maintain your full-time status. As a graduate student, full-time status is really based on how you are pursuing your program, if you're pursuing it on a full-time basis. And the definition of a full-time graduate student at Memorial is one who works no more than 24 hours a week, right? And that's a definition that is, it's not an immigration definition, it's a definition from the institution for all of our graduate students, Canadian, international alike. It basically means, you know, when you're studying a graduate program, you need to devote your full-time attention to that program, right? So you can't be working more than 24 hours a week. There are certainly people who are full-time employees who pursue graduate studies. They generally would do that on a part-time basis because they work more than 24 hours a week. Okay, so full-time for an undergrad student is a minimum of 9 credit hours. Full-time for a graduate student is one who works no more than 24 hours a week. So then part-time for an undergrad would be anything less than 9 credit hours, and part-time for a grad student again would be, you would have to actually switch, you know, your program to part-time. Scheduled break. So a scheduled break is primarily an immigration definition, but how does it apply to the university calendar? Because a scheduled break from immigration perspective is a break that is built in as part of your program and that is outlined in the academic calendar, right? It is not a break that you choose to take from your studies. So scheduled breaks will vary whether or not your program has them, or when they are, will vary depending on your program of study. So our graduate students have 0 scheduled breaks in their program because graduate enrollment automatically rolls over, right, every semester. Undergraduate students typically will have the spring semester as a scheduled break. But there are some undergraduate programs that are very structured and that would have spring as a regular academic semester, right? But most undergrad programs are not structured. The ones that are generally our competitive entry program. So our Bachelor of Engineering, Bachelor of Commerce co-op, Bachelor of Science and Nursing, our Bachelors of Education and things like that. Okay, so you want to pay attention. Undergrad students, in addition to the spring, possibly being an optional semester or scheduled break, will have the time in between semesters. So from when your exams end to when the next semester starts as a scheduled break. And Memorial also has in the middle of a semester like a midterm break or a reading week. Most of those breaks are very short. So from an immigration perspective, we'll talk about being able to work during a scheduled break. To work during a scheduled break, the break has to be at least 7 days long. So there are some scheduled breaks if you have them whereby you may be able to work full time. And we'll talk about that, but it's not all the breaks because they have to be at least 7 days. Okay. So schedule break is a break that is built in as part of your program. It's not a break you choose to take. A leave of absence would be kind of a break that you would choose to take. And not necessarily by choice, but because of course we all find ourselves in situations sometimes in our lives where we have, you know, very little choice but to perhaps take a leave of absence due to medical reasons, bereavement, family emergencies, what have you, right? But a leave of absence would not be a scheduled break. Graduate students can formally request and be approved for a leave of absence. Our undergraduate students don't need to make any formal request for a leave of absence, so it's kind of an unauthorized leave for undergraduate students. Undergrad students, because you choose, like you have to actively register every semester, you don't have to kind of make the opt-out request, whereas our grad students, because they automatically are registered, it's like an opt-out for a leave of absence. But our undergrad students, if they are looking to take a leave of absence from studies, just wouldn't register. You maintain your eligibility to register for up to 3 consecutive semesters, but if you aren't, you know, if you go that long and don't register, you'd have to reapply for admission. But a leave of absence can have, whether it's authorized or unauthorized, can have significant impacts on your immigration status. You know, you can't work during a leave of absence, and they can impact you in the future if you want to apply for a post-grad work permit. Another term is academic suspension. So an academic suspension could happen if you are performing poorly academically or if there's academic misconduct. Sometimes it's a required like full-on withdrawal from the program and you'd have to reapply for admission after a certain period of time. Other times the suspension might be for 2 semesters, you know, for a period whereby you couldn't register and you would have to wait out that time. So academic suspensions, again, are a type of leave that can have significant impacts on your immigration status. Okay, so I think those are some important terms and will help to serve you as we kind of discuss the conditions of your study permit, as well as things that are important to know to be in compliance with those statuses. Okay, so a study permit obviously is I would say your most important Canadian immigration document. It is what gives you status. It authorizes you to study. It may authorize you to work. Immigration laws, you know, are complicated, but we are trying to boil it down as, 4 things we want you to remember, because we know you're getting a lot of information here. The very first one is to not let your study permit expire. So it is very important to know the expiry date that is written on your study permit. All right. So check it. Every semester, is this the semester my study permit's expiring? Am I going to finish my studies, before the study permit expiry? And if not, many months in advance, you want to make the effort to do the extension of your study permit. So the expiry date of your study permit is written there. However, there are sections of the immigration regulations that would say, despite the expiry date on your study permit might actually become invalid earlier than that date, right? And so if you finish your studies earlier than you expect to, then your study permit could become invalid within the 90 days of completing your studies, right? If you just cease to study and you haven't actually completed your studies, your study permit can become invalid the day you cease being a registered student or being enrolled as a student. Okay, so any stop or gaps in your studies can have big impacts, and one could be on the study permit validity, despite the fact that on paper, the expiry date might be years from now. So it's important to keep that in mind. If you stop studying or if you graduate from a program, your study permit could become invalid earlier than the date on the document. Okay. But if your study permit is due to expire soon and you haven't finished your studies, you want to extend it. As long as you apply to extend it and they receive your application before it expires, it might take a while to get a decision on a new document. While you are kind of waiting, you have what's called maintain status, right? So that's a legal status that would allow you to stay and continue to study and work. What you don't want to have happen is to be out of status. So you don't want your study permit to expire and not to have applied for it to be extended. Because if that's the case, then as of the date of expiry, you then lose your authorization to study and work. So you'd have to stop your studies, right? And so that can happen in the middle of a semester and it can seriously impact you right in your academic journey. Now, if you have gone out of status, so your study permit has expired and you have not applied to extend it, so you do not have maintained status, there is a period of time where you could be in Canada, you can't study, you can't work, but you could make an application to restore that status. But you have a limited window to do that, right? And it can take months and months to get a decision on a restoration. So you're really putting your life on hold. So you certainly want to avoid that. So if it's not clear already, don't let your study permit expire. Do your best to put those checkpoints in place to ensure that you know when that study permit is set to expire, and that if you cease your studies, that you connect with us so you can understand what's the validity of your study permit now. Okay. A second very important thing to know about your study permit is that a condition is placed on all study permit holders. There's a few exceptions to this rule, but for most study permit holders to actively pursue your studies and maintain your enrollment, right? So what does that mean? Because it, can be interpreted different things, but basically you should be full-time student every regular academic semester, and you should be making every effort to complete your program in the amount of time it is set to be completed, right? So if you're in a 4-year bachelor's, you should be trying to do that in 4 years. If you have a 1-year master's, right, you should be making that reasonable progress. Sometimes it happens, of course, that you might not finish it in that 4 years. You might need a little bit of time. I'm not saying that that's not reasonable and that you won't be successful in a study permit extension. It does happen, right? But the officer still wants to see that you're complying with the conditions of your study permit, so that you're making those efforts to complete the program in a reasonable time frame, that you're maintaining your full-time status, because that's how you do, right, a 4-year degree in 4 years is you're full-time in your regular academic semesters. If something happens and you have to take that break from your studies, right, that leave of absence, whether it's authorized or unauthorized, it doesn't necessarily mean you're not actively pursuing your studies, but it also means you might not just be able to stay in Canada during that leave, right? Because it depends on how long the leave is and the reasons for it. So if you encounter those situations, it's super important that you connect with us. A third very important thing to know about your study permit is to read the conditions of your study permit. Don't take for granted that your study permit's going to let you work and that you can work in any field you want to, right? So you want to have a look at that study permit. You want to read the language that is there. Commonly, we'll see conditions on study permits that would exempt people from being able to work in certain fields, right? Because perhaps they didn't need a medical or have a valid medical. So for example, it could limit you from not being able to work like in health related fields with children or with the elderly. That would be really important to know if you happen to apply and look for a part-time job as a home care support worker, or over the summer you wanted to work as a camp counselor for like a children's day camp, right? You know, there can be those different conditions and exclusions on your study permit, so super important for you to read and understand that. Another thing is that a condition has to be actually written on your study permit that says you can work if you're eligible, right? So if your study permit doesn't include that condition, then you wouldn't be able to work. You couldn't get a social insurance number. You know, if the condition's not there, we'd have to look, well, was that a mistake? What do you, and you want to work, what do you need to do that? So it's important that the condition is written there that authorizes you to work. It's also important to understand what the condition means, because what you'll see is it'll say may accept employment on or off campus if meeting the eligibility criteria as per, and it's going to quote like a section of the regulations, the Immigration Act, right? So what does the act say? So essentially, in order for you to work, you have to be a full-time student, right? And you are limited in terms of the number of hours that you can work. So Immigration Canada treats on-campus employment and off-campus employment differently. So to be eligible to work on campus, you have to be a full-time student. They don't limit the number of hours you can work on campus, right? To work off campus, you have to be a full-time student in a program of study that's at least 6 months and leads to a degree or diploma or certificate. And you're limited for off-campus work to 24 hours a week, except during scheduled breaks, right? And there's lots of rules around scheduled breaks. So you can work full-time in scheduled breaks, but only if it is a scheduled break. So it's part of your scheduled break program. You were full-time in the semester before the break, and you will be full-time in the semester after the break, right? And the break has to be at least 7 days. And you can't work more than or have a certain number of days break in a year, right? So it does get kind of more complicated the more you kind of think about that. Okay, so it's really important that you're abiding by those rules and you're not working more hours. And it's important to note, again, that graduate students don't have any scheduled breaks. So our grad students are always limited to 24 hours a week off campus. And as we already discussed, graduate students are also limited to 24 hours a week total on or off campus combined. So even though your study permit doesn't limit the number of on-campus hours you can work, there might be other regulations like institutional policies that would limit that, right? And it's super important that you not work more, you know, hours and that you don't let those hours kind of impact you academically, right? Because if that happens, you know, and you face academic suspension, everything is tied to you being here as a student and maintaining compliance with that study permit. So making sure you're a registered student. All right. So the working hours can be complicated. So if you ever have any doubts or questions, let us know. Don't take for granted that you're good to work 24 hours a week. You can work full time a scheduled break if you're, again, there's lots of regulations about that. Because in the end, if you work without authorization, right, it's your status. It's you who will face consequences, right? Yeah, that can be quite hard. All right, so let's pause here for a moment and kind of reflect on the things we've talked about in terms of a study permit. So we're going to go into our quiz 3. So really appreciate the engagement so far. Let's keep it up. I'm going to read this question and then type into the chat if you think it's true or false. So undergraduate students can work full-time during their scheduled break. Is this true or false? Right. So we've established that undergraduate students generally have a scheduled break, and it's important to note that they can work full-time during a scheduled break, but they have to be full-time in the semester before the break. They have to be full-time in the semester after the break. The break has to be at least 7 days, and they can't have more than 180 days break in a year. Okay, but generally true is the correct answer for number 1. All right, let's move on to number 2. Graduate students do not have any scheduled break and as a result cannot work more than 24 hours a week off campus during their program of study. Is this true or false? It is true. Perfect, everyone. Yeah. All right, number 3. Part-time students are eligible to work. True or false? It's false. Excellent. So if you have a study permit, that is, right? Your study permit is not authorizing you to work unless you're a full-time student. And number 4, students who are on leave, whether it's authorized or unauthorized, are not eligible to work on and off campus. Is this true or false? And this is true. Perfect. Thank you guys so much. Excellent. Okay, so we've covered a lot of things and we're getting through it, but we have a few more things to go over. Your study permit, again, as we've discussed, is primarily what's authorizing you to study, but it might also authorize you to work, right? But the idea with the work component of your study permit is it's just part-time work that's kind of outside of your studies. But what if your studies requires you to do some form of work experience? So there's an integrated work experience component to that program, right? And your program might call it a co-op, they might call it a work term. It could be a placement, it could be an internship, it could be paid, it could not be paid, right? But if there's a work component to your program, whether it's called a co-op or not, whether it's paid or not paid, it does require work authorization. All right, so you would need a separate work permit, and the work authorization on your study permit is not going to cover that. So you need the co-op work permit. Now, a co-op work permit, you might have, if you've been admitted into a program that has a work integrated component, you may have, as part of your study permit application, applied for the co-op work permit at the same time, right? So you may have requested that. So when you get your study permit approval and then come through the port of entry and your study permit is printed, you may also get the co-op work permit at that time, okay? Although we do see sometimes that that doesn't happen necessarily, even if you indicated you had a co-op program, it just kind of gets lost in that processing. Or many times our students aren't directly admitted into these co-op programs, but while they're in Canada may get that admission because they tend to be more competitive entry programs, right? So if it's the case that you don't get the co-op work permit when you come in and you are in a program where you would need it, then you can apply from within Canada. And a co-op work permit kind of goes along with your study permit, so it won't go past your study permit, and it needs a letter that confirms that these placements are a requirement for you to graduate. It can't be more than 50% of your program, and it has to be mandatory. So you can make that application for the co-op work permit from inside of Canada. And you want to do it far, far in advance because it can take 6-8 months sometimes to get these co-op work permits, and you generally need that permit in your hand before you can start that placement, right? So you want to be proactive if your program requires that. And the good news is that it's a relatively simple application. You don't have to pay any fee for it, right? So then these next 2 questions should be easy. All right, number 1 in our quiz 4. Tell me, is this true or false? To obtain a co-op work permit, you must be in a program where co-op is a mandatory part of the studies. Yep, it's true. Absolutely true. If it wasn't, it's useless, right? This work permit really only authorizes you to engage in work that is a requirement for your program. So if you're not registered in a co-op program, if this work placement is not approved by your program, then this work permit does nothing for you, right? So you're not eligible for it. It has to be mandatory. All right, and number 2, the application fee for a co-op work permit is $500. It's false. Yeah, there's actually, I don't know if there's anything else that is for free through Immigration Canada, but you don't have to pay for this one. But obviously you've paid for your study permit application, and you would need that for the co-op work permit. Okay, so we're going to get into our next kind of thing that we can help you with, and that's your postgrad work permit or PGWP, right? So many students upon completion of their program may be interested in remaining in Canada and seeking employment. And so this might be an option that's available to you. And a postgrad work permit is an open work permit that allows you to stay in Canada and work for up to 3 years. An open work permit means that it's not tied to any specific job or any specific employer. You don't need a job offer to apply, right? What is making you eligible for a postgrad work permit is because you graduated from a postgrad work permit eligible program in Canada and you meet a bunch of other eligibility criteria. So it's not a guaranteed thing. Not every international student who comes to Canada and completes a program is going to be eligible and obtain a postgrad work permit. Not every program that Memorial offers is eligible to get you a postgrad work permit program, right? So if this is something that's important to you, it's really important that you understand those eligibility criteria and that you work to complete your program in a way that is going to make you eligible for a postgrad work permit, right? So your program to be postgrad work permit would have to be at least an 8-month program. You would have to be full-time throughout your program, right? So taking breaks, can impact you. There are some exceptions to this continuous full-time enrollment, but not very many, right? You have to complete the majority, at least 50% of your program in person. So if your program is blended or if you happen to have online courses that are offered, and there are some programs where there are a lot of online courses because some degrees can be done online or in person. So you have to be really careful. And there can be, a tendency to maybe be interested in the online in terms of being flexible for work, right? But that can really get you in trouble down the road. You need to make sure that the majority, or at least half is in person. And so you can't assume that, I'm going to get in-person courses in the future. So you certainly should be taking in-person courses whenever you can. And it has to be study in Canada too, right? That's important. You also will have to, when the time comes to apply for a postgrad work permit, do a language test. You have to show you meet a minimum language eligibility. Okay. You also, have to maintain compliance with the conditions of your study permit. And if you are graduating from a diploma or a certificate program, that program might have to meet the field of study requirements. So not all diploma or certificate programs are eligible for a postgrad work permit. Bachelor's, master's, and PhD generally are, again, provided they are full-time in person, right, in Canada programs. So this can get quite complicated. There's like a long list of eligibility criteria. There's a lot that happens when you transition from being a student to maybe going on a work permit. So it's important that if you're unsure of your eligibility that you connect with us. We do different sessions and ways to kind of get you this information. So it's just important to consider now how important it is to be full-time, to choose those in-person courses, right? And if things happen that are going to impact your ability to be full-time or to do those in person, connect with us about those things. Okay. So another quick quiz. One, is this true or false? A postgrad work permit is an open work permit. Is that true or false? Perfect. Excellent. The next one I didn't discuss. So let's see if we get it right. Number 2, a postgrad work permit is a one-time opportunity. Is that true or false? Number 2. Yeah, it is actually. So you can only obtain, I didn't mention this, but you can only obtain a postgrad work permit once, right? So say, for example, you come and you do your bachelor's degree in Canada. And at the end of your bachelor's degree, you apply and you obtain your postgrad work permit. After a couple of years, you decide I want to do my master's and you do that in Canada. Well, at the end of your master's, you could not obtain a postgrad work permit because you already had it, right? So a postgrad work permit, it is a great opportunity. There are not many open work permits, especially ones that can be for 3 years in Canada. So if you're looking to be able to work in Canada, it's a great thing to be able to avail of, but you certainly want to kind of plan that out and look at your career, your education, your immigration goals. All right. And number 3, to obtain a postgrad work permit, students must be continuously full-time, except during their scheduled break. And it's also okay to be part-time in your last semester if you only have part-time credit hours to graduate. Is this true or false? Yeah. Perfect. It's true. Excellent. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Okay, so now moving on to kind of where can you get immigration information? I hope you found the information that we provide useful, and we really do hope that you continue to connect with us, you know, as a source for information through the immigration advising team at the Internationalization Office. But if you aren't connecting with us, right, or you're looking online for information, be very careful. Make sure that the information is coming from the government of Canada. So Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada. Their website would be canada.ca. If you type in cic.gc.ca, you'll get there as well. But you'll see a lot of websites, especially if you Google, you know, and with those AI searches in Google, and you'll see kind of the Canada, like the maple leaf. So you'll think, oh, this is canada.ca, but it's actually canadavisa.ca, right? That's not information that's coming from IRCC. There are tons of immigration consultants out there and lawyers out there that put up information on their website, and we put up information on our website, and other universities put up information on their website, right? Which is digesting and interpreting that immigration information, right? So it would be best to get the information from the source, which is IRCC. But if you're coming upon those websites, right, and ours included, you want to know, well, who is putting out that content? Is the person who's putting out that content authorized, right, to give immigration advice? And so in Canada, immigration advice is a regulated profession. If you're a lawyer, right, you are authorized to give that advice. Of course, you want to make sure that that lawyer that you're getting information from is in good standing with the legal association of the province where they are practicing, right? And also, outside of an immigration lawyer, a regulated consultant can give advice. And there's only one regulatory body, and that's the College of Immigration and Citizenship Consultants, right? So if you come across somebody's website and they're a consultant, they should be giving their number, right? Or you can search them even if you don't know their number. So for example, you can go to the CICC website, the College of Immigration and Citizenship Consultants, and you can search my name and you'll see what my license number is. You'll see if I'm currently an active advisor. You'll see if there's been any complaints or disciplinary action against me, right? So you want to make sure that they are a consultant in good standing. Okay, so those are really where you should be getting your information from us, from IRCC directly, or from another party. Make sure that they are in good standing with the regulatory CICC. All right, so another quick quiz. True or false? 1, my friends and family are the best source of information when it comes to immigration. Is that true or false? False, yeah. Unless you happen to be like my brother, right, or sister. So in which case, yeah, your family is a great source. Number 2, it's illegal to provide immigration advice without having an appropriate license and authorization in Canada. Is that true or false? It's true. Yep. So you can't do it for consideration. So this is something too you got to be really careful of, you know, and if you might have had assistance through educational agents, for example, in applying to Memorial, but they shouldn't be the ones unless they're regulated consultants helping you with your study permit application, right? You have to be regulated to give that advice. All right. So cluing up, we're going to talk about all kinds of different ways, right, that you're going to be able to connect with us as you have immigration questions. One thing I want to point out is something called a Brightspace course shell. So Brightspace is the technology that Memorial has for, it's also called D2L, for its online course content. And even your courses that are in person, your professors may have like a course shell online where you can have discussion forums where they can post material and things like that, right? So we have a course, it's called Immigration Support for International Students. It's not a credit course. It's not anything you can register for. It is a course that we are going to add you to, right? So throughout kind of August and September, as we see students getting registered in their courses, we're going to just add this, right? So when you log in to online.mun.ca, you will see a list of courses there. So at some point you should see this pop up, which is immigration support for international students. Okay. And we have different units that we have here, and we've changed it since this time, but you'll see like just ways to connect with us. And then we have a unit on study permit conditions and compliance. We have a unit on working while you're a student. We have a unit on extending your study permit. We have a unit on post-grad work permit. We have a unit for students with their families. And there are recordings of like tutorials or information sessions about those topics that you can view, right? That might help to answer a lot of your questions. There's quizzes too that you can complete, right? To kind of refresh and test your knowledge on those things. And also if we host different information sessions, which we plan to do, you know, whether they're virtual or in person, you'll see the calendar of events there. And if they're virtual, you'll be able to access them by just logging in to online.mun.ca and seeing that course. So immigration support for international students, right? So that's one way, right, is to kind of attend those sessions, engage with us in Brightspace. Other ways are to schedule an appointment. So we have available multiple appointments every day, 30-minute appointments at a time. And you can go to our MS bookings page and you can choose to meet with an advisor in person. You can choose to meet with an advisor virtually. You can see our schedule and availability and just book directly there. Okay. If you don't have an appointment and you want to drop in and see us, then we will have virtual drop-in sessions. So generally at some point every day, usually between 12 and 1 of our staff is available here in WebEx, and you kind of enter a virtual waiting room and we admit students one at a time to kind of answer those questions, right? And so that's a way, if you don't see an appointment that's available for another week or so and you have a quick question you want to pop in and that works for you, you can do so. Our live sessions are recordings, which we talked about, and you can also email us at immigrationadvising@mun.ca. We do respond to our emails within 1 to 2 business days. Excuse me, so generally you get a quick kind of response, and we have our website here which outlines the various different ways that you can connect with us. Okay, so we will be looking to update that very soon by the end of August with kind of our fall sessions and schedule. All right. So that is finally it, all the information we wanted to present. So thanks so much for being an attentive audience. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here now, and Panisse is going to help us to kind of moderate those questions. I think we have about 23 minutes left.